Destruction of the environment. Explanations by Ta and Billy. Destruction of the environment as the consequence of overpopulation. By Billy Edward Albert Meyer. Fig Special Bulletin No. 93, October 2015, page 1. Translation by Flaw. The 3rd of November, 2015. The following article is a summary of prophecies, predictions, and probability calculations, which were discussed in various conversations between the Pleasure and Ta and Beam in regard to the environmental destruction of the planet Earth as the consequence of machinations and modes of behavior which are criminal, irresponsible, and have gotten very badly out of the control of the good human nature due to the terrestrial human overpopulation. The detailed data and facts which are especially mentioned in the article correspond to the information and calculations of the Pleasure and Ta. The world will certainly not end, but it will very dramatically change, as will also be the case in regard to the entire humanity itself and its existence. To what extent these drastic changes become reality depends on how and in which measure the world population increases, and therefore how much the worldwide overpopulation continues to increase in the future, just as it also further depends on how much further the impairment, destruction, and elimination of nature, its fauna and flora, the climate, and the planet, called forth through the criminal machinations of the overpopulation, will continue to be irresponsibly advanced. Right on the front line of the elimination of nature as well as the destruction of the flora and fauna are thereby agriculture, as well as the commercial nurseries, and so forth, as well as many human beings among the people who spread millions of tons of chemical poisons into nature and its fauna and flora, as well as on and in the food crops, in order to have these flourish and grow and to protect them from weeds, from damage, and from vermin. The incomprehensible amount of chemical poisons which are deposited in the food plants of all kinds and then are eaten by the human being lead to him/her becoming sick, wasting away, and finally dying. And the fact that also valuable plants, animals, other creatures, lizards, insects, aquatic life forms, and birds are poisoned and exterminated by these chemical poisons is a further inexcusable factor which, on one hand, must be held against agriculture and the commercial garden businesses, and so forth, but also the agronomists and propagandists of chemicals and those among the people who are users of chemicals. This is so because, on one hand, as a result of their stupidity or greed for profit, they consciencelessly utilize chemical poisons and introduce them into the natural foods, and thereby also into the animals which are kept and slaughtered for the meat requirement of the human beings, which then of course get into the human food cycle, and thereby endanger the health of the human beings and affect them in a form that damages the health. But on the other hand, it is also the agriculture and the other businesses which raise and fatten the cattle, poultry, and all kinds of animals, whereby these feedlot animals are treated with diverse antibiotics, and indeed prophylactically, in order to prevent illnesses. That these antibiotics also deposit themselves in the flesh of the cattle, poultry, and the animals, and, when eaten by the human beings, are then again assimilated and create a resistance to antibiotics in them. Consequently, she can no longer be healed from diverse illnesses, or can no longer be protected from infections, and so forth, which often results in death, does not concern the raisers of cattle, poultry, and animals at all. The main thing for them is only the greed condition financial profit, because, from this kind of seeing and acting, and thereby in this regard, they do not know any responsibility for the fellow human beings, nor for nature and its fauna and flora, which they poison and contaminate. And also in the future that will continue for a long time, consequently still many extinctions, destructions, and eliminations will arise in nature in regard to flora and fauna, and worldwide, still very many human beings, young and old of all levels of society, will become sick and succumb to lingering illness and death as a consequence of the irresponsible, profit-greedy, or simply inconsiderate, stupid, and dim-witted misuse in regard to antibiotics and chemical poisons. Now, those super clever ones, who regardless of their unknowledge and their stupidity want to know everything better, or who are paid with horrendous bribery money for their mendacious assertions, are, without intelligence, barking up the wrong tree, are tangled in unsupportable lies, or are completely brain dead. This is so because, in twisting the facts and not understanding, they believe, lie or invent in a primitively stupid form that basically, first and foremost and solely, the chemical corporations and chemical producers would bear the blame for everything. Thus they ascribe the blame for the prevailing disaster of all chemically caused poisoning, destruction and elimination of nature and the waters, as well as the extermination of thousands of life-essential insects, plants, birds, animals and creatures, and so forth, as well as for the poisoning of the natural food, such as vegetables, berries, herbs, fruit and all kinds of grain plants, just solely the companies and other producers, which manufacture the poisonous chemical products. But hardly anything or nothing at all is said about the fact that all those human beings who consciencelessly use the chemical poison mace and bring it out and into the environment and into the natural foods, the plants and into the waters, and therefore into the whole of nature and its fauna and flora, and thereby poison everything, are irresponsible and indeed criminally and feloniously in the very first position of culpability. Therefore it is not made clear that first and foremost the users and consumers of the chemical masses are the punishably irresponsible ones who poison everything, also the human beings as well as the whole of nature with everything associated with it, and thereby provoke and bring about illnesses, rampantly spreading diseases and even extermination, death and elimination. In regard to this, the agriculture and the commercial nurseries are in the very first position, however also those human beings and authorities, and so forth, who just as consciencelessly and just as irresponsibly spread chemical poisons in their gardens, fields, meadows and roadsides, railway lines or otherwise in nature and the environment. Therefore it is not primarily the chemical companies and other manufacturers of chemical poisons, which are applied for the purpose of the faster and better growth as well as for the protection against insects and damage and so forth in nature and its fauna and flora and also in natural foods and so forth. Rather it is fundamentally the users and consumers of the chemical masses. The chemical companies and other manufacturers of chemical products, which are applied in nature and the environment and so forth, come truthfully only in the second most important position, and indeed just because they are only the producers of the chemical substances, through whose manufacture and consumption they financially make billions in profit. Above all the chemical poison bombs are mendaciously recommended by agronomists and propagandists, and are bought and used by farmers and gardeners, by authorities and businesses, and so forth, as well as by private persons in order to advance the growth of vegetables, grain and other plants, and as protection from insects as well as vermin and from damage, whereby financially horrendous profit-making or some other advantage always determines the mode of behavior regarding this. Therefore it is not the chemical companies and chemical producers which come first in the misuse of chemical means, through which everything and anything is poisoned, rather it is the farmers and the agronomists who advise them. But it is also the commercial nurseries, authorities, companies and all those among the people who use the chemical poisons for the plant growth and the direct or prophylactic protection of plants, as a rule, as a consequence of the recommendations of agronomists, propagandists and supporters without conscience from among the people. And once again, truthfully, in the first position, it is therefore the farmers and gardeners and the people who make use of all the poisons which are promoted to them through propaganda and apply them to the natural foods, such as vegetables, herbs, berries, fruit and grain, and poison these with the chemical substances. The fact is that every farmer and gardener as well as every human being from among the people does not have to let anything be insinuated via propaganda in regard to making use of chemical poisons, which are supposed to let the plants grow better and protect them from insects and so forth. Even when propaganda is used, every human being has his or her own intellect, will in a certain rationality, from which she is able to decide for himself/herself what is right and wrong and what is irresponsible or responsible. Therefore no human being is compelled through any propaganda to apply any chemical poisons in the environment, in nature and its fauna and flora, because everyone can decide in complete responsibility for himself/herself without letting himself/herself be influenced. Consequently, everyone is competent in regard to exercising and bearing responsibility or irresponsibility. Consequently, there is no excuse at all when action is taken in irresponsibility. This is equally the case in regard to the use of antibiotics, because every human being who utilizes such stuff is to be designated criminal and irresponsible. Thus, therefore, also every farmer, and, in regard to natural foods such as vegetables and fruit, and so forth, also gardeners who spread the poisons, as well as all others who treat livestock, poultry and other living creatures with antibiotics, and raise and fatten them for meat production and as nourishment for human beings. Therefore, every human being himself/herself also decides in regard to this in his or her completely own responsibility or irresponsibility, whether he/she wants to use antibiotics and poisons, and thereby endanger the health of human beings and make them sick and even kill them or not. Principally, it is therefore not the manufacturers of the chemical fertilizers and pesticides and the antibiotics which are poisonous to human beings, nature, fauna and flora, and therefore not the chemical companies and chemical producers, just as it is also not the propagandists who bear the blame first and foremost for the poisoning of the natural foods, nature and its fauna and flora, and even for their extermination as well as the diseases of the human being. Truthfully, it is namely the conscienceless users and consumers of all the poisonous chemical substances and the antibiotics, which are used out of pure pathological craving for profit, be it in regard to the irresponsible, felonious spreading of the poisons on natural foods of all kinds, or in regard to the nature and its fauna and flora, or in regard to the feeding of antibiotics to livestock, poultry and all kinds of animals and other creatures, whose meat, contaminated with poison and antibiotics, serves as nourishment for the human being. If the whole thing continues in the form in which everything in regard to this has come about since the beginning of the new time, from the year 1844 up to the present time, then a very bad future threatens the earth humanity. And this is also the case in regard to the overpopulation, because if nothing changes for the better regarding this, by the drastic stemming of the worldwide overpopulation by means of a strictly controlled stoppage of births and a controlled regulation of births, then a very terrible future is in store for the world and its humanity as a consequence of its globally destructive and eliminating as well as irresponsible machinations. That which will thereby threaten in the future, and will in all probably become reality due to the manifold, crass egoism of the human being of the earth as well as due to his or her uninsightfulness and irresponsibility, and which regarding that can also still be cited prophetically, predictively and as probability calculations, is additionally the following. Still today unteachable so-called experts, who are often paid by companies for wrong assertions, lies and trivializations of the effective truth in regard to the climate change, and thereby financially profit, deny the climate change, more specifically, the consequences connected with it, with irrational assertions that the entire matter of climatic change is completely natural and normal. Belonging with the same sort who trivialize the effective facts are all those know-it-alls and wise braggarts from among the people who, as a result of their stupidity and idiocy, do not recognize the reality and its truth, and dreamily go on living in illusions about a nature which is intact, and its fauna and flora as well as a completely natural climate change in a healthy world, as well as a better, good and healthy future. And unfortunately there are far too many of this kind of know-it-all who wander around blindly on the earth and do not perceive the effective reality in regard to all the destruction or elimination which is caused by the criminal machinations of the boundless overpopulation to the world, its nature, fauna and flora as well as to all waters, native forests and other forests, meadows, seas, wetlands, glaciers, landscapes and to the climate, and so forth. Regarding that there are, for example, idiotic stupid speeches made about how just in the last 2,000 years several earth-warming phases and respectively, earth coolings, would have occurred and that plants should have profited from an increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. Naturally, seen in world terms, the average temperature at the time of the Roman Empire and of the Middle Ages was higher than today, because at that time also warm periods prevailed, which however cannot be compared with the consequences of the current climate change. If one goes back even 6,000 to 7,000 years, then, at that time, there was also a warm period, which led to the Arctic being largely free of ice. But if one penetrates even further into the past, then it can be scientifically proven today that, at the time of the dinosaurs and all other primeval creatures, the proportion of carbon dioxide was 4 to 6 times higher than it is today, which naturally also had effects on all genera and species of the plant world, which exhibited a gigantic growth. With the climate change and the global changes associated with that, the food and water crisis as well as the natural catastrophes, great problems of the present and future must be addressed, because when everything is precisely viewed and considered, then it becomes clear and obvious how very massively the environment is stressed by the overpopulation and urbanization. In particular, the entire humanity as well as the entire nature and its fauna and flora as well as the planet itself become negatively affected through the climate change called forth by the wrongdoing of the human being, whereby erosion and desertification, as stark consequences of the overpopulation machinations, cause just as enormous destruction in the whole ecosystem as the monocultures and the farming of plants do, which are in demand in the world market. And that the plants generally still grow locally is like a miracle, which only occurs through the absolute conscienceless and reckless exploitation of the resources of the earth, soil, nature, forest and water, whereby for that, however, more and more stretches of land are made completely infertile and irreversibly lie fallow, and above all, namely in developing countries, which predominantly in every regard are used up, exploited and squandered to the last drop, without conscience and feloniously, by the well-placed, big companies, worth billions, of the rich industrialized countries. This is the case, seen above all in regard to the human beings of the third world and developing countries, impoverished and made sick through the machinations of the industrial countries' companies, who have no chance at all to defend themselves against it, because, as a rule, the governments of those countries are so corrupt that they let their own people simply perish in their need and misery. The increasing environmental pollution, environmental poisoning, and the environmental destruction due to the logging of the native forests has become extremely problematic for nature and its fauna and flora, and has led to great destruction as well as to tremendous climatic changes. When the future of the Amazon rainforest is envisaged, then, by the year 2030 it will be irreversibly destroyed by up to 60% due to the conscienceless and criminal logging of it. If the native forests in Asia are viewed and considered, then it is clear that already today 3/4 of them are cleared and destroyed beyond recovery. But also in Africa the deforestation catastrophe widens, and indeed to an extremely bad degree, because presently only 8% of the native forests are still untouched. The fact is that worldwide, every year, native forests are destroyed and eliminated to an area of as much as 3 times that of Switzerland, which amounts to 41,285 square kilometers calculated without the mountain areas. Therefore, worldwide, there are around 125,000 square kilometers which are destroyed and eliminated annually. See Appendix, Area of Switzerland, at the end of the article. Of course, that has devastating consequences for nature and its fauna and flora as well as for the climate and the oxygen content in the atmosphere, which is essential for all life forms on the earth. The fact, namely, is that the tropical rainforests, that is to say, the native forests, produce 40% of all the oxygen. That notwithstanding, the rainforests are inconsiderately and feloniously exploited, destroyed and totally eliminated for the sake of vile mammon and profit. Thus every year gigantic areas of native forests fall victim to mining, slash and burn clearing as well as to the timber industry, gas and oil production as well as to the construction of hydroelectric power stations, and so forth. Many native forest areas, that is to say, untouched rainforest areas, which were cleared and continue to be cleared, are planted full of diverse plants with which biofuels can be manufactured, whereby more than a half of the newly obtained land is misused in this form. The elimination of the tropical rainforests alone, with timber harvesting machines and so forth, contributes around 25% to the worldwide CO2 emission. If the developing country, Indonesia, is viewed and considered, which today is the third greatest CO2 producer, then, at the current time, the peat fires there cause emissions of 700-800 million tons of carbon dioxide. If the CO2 output in regard to the coming deforestation of the tropics is viewed and considered overall, then by the year 2100, 100 to 130 billion tons of CO2 can be expected to be produced. Calculations show that when sugarcane oil palms are planted as a substitute for the logged rainforests, that then a time of 50 to 120 years would be necessary before the CO2 output which is saved, with fossil fuels and clearing, could be made up for. If corn or soybeans were planted instead, then it would even require a time of 400 to 1,600 years. It is not only the rainforests which are destroyed by fire and eliminated, rather also large areas of bush and shrubland, steppes as well as forests, and indeed through lightning strikes. Also human beings are to blame who carelessly, deliberately and irresponsibly ignite bushfires and forest fires. However, more and more frequently, bush and shrub areas as well as forests are also quite consciously burned as a result of arson out of criminal commercial speculative grounds in order to create building land, which is becoming ever rarer, for factories, houses, settlements, sports facilities and streets and so forth, whereby the whole thing is based in the irresponsible measures caused through the very badly getting out of control of the good human nature and needs of the overpopulation which continues to spread worldwide. If nature and its fauna and flora is viewed and considered, then appallingly, the very extreme decrease in biodiversity which occurs through the destruction of the environment is to be decried. In regard to all approximately 32 million species and kinds of plants and animals, more than two-thirds live in the native forests, whereby many of them are threatened with extinction or have already become extinct because of the felonious logging and clearing of the rainforests. With the whole matter of the danger and extermination in regards to plants and animals, also new natural germs play a very important role, as well as foreign species from other ecosystems spreading themselves, whereby endemic species of plants and animals are displaced and even exterminated. Especially the future will bring the situation whereby, in commercial gardening and agriculture, endemic weeds, and also those introduced from foreign countries due to globalization, will become rampant, flourish and will no longer be able to be fought with herbicides and consequently will no longer be able to be exterminated. Consequently, they will cause the fertile land to become overgrown and deteriorate to being infertile. The reason for that will be found in the fact that the weeds of all kinds change so much that they become resistant to all herbicides, that is to say, weed killers, and spread so much that they displace the valuable food plants and take the space necessary for them to thrive and live, which self-evidently has an extremely negative effect on the production of natural food. Already today diverse kinds of weeds can no longer be fought, because they have changed so much and adapted so much to the chemical poisons, due to the worldwide irresponsible chemical application of herbicides in the course of the last decades, that they no longer can be exterminated. And this is already the case worldwide with various weeds, such as in regard to the Amaranthus palmeri, which spreads out for square kilometers catastrophically in diverse locations in the USA, that is Monsanto's Palmer's amaranth, glyphosate pigweed, Roundup-resistant monster plant, new high-tech weed out of the underworld and not able to be killed, was introduced from South America and pushes out, infests and exterminates all garden and agricultural plants. This is also characteristic of many other kinds of weeds which have been introduced from other countries or are endemic, which are already herbicide resistant or will be in the future. Also in Europe there exist already very many plants as well as animals, all kinds of insects and other creatures, which have been introduced due to globalization, whereby these, according to precise Plagiarian information, in regard to all genera and species altogether amount to a total number of 12,000. Many of them have already acclimatized so much since their intentional introduction or unintentional introduction that one can no longer imagine the European ecosystem without them. And that will continue to come about in the future due to the globalization and the thereby connected introduction of plants and all kinds of living organisms. If the many foreign plants which have been introduced into Europe are considered, then there also exists a great terrible thing in regard to them in the current time, such as concerning the goldenrod which comes from the USA, Composita, Asteraceae, with around 80 mostly North American kinds. Herbaceous perennials with undivided, alternate leaves and gold-yellow basket-shaped flowers. The kind which grows up to 1 meter high, common goldenrod, Solidago gigantea, Solidago canadensis, grows in dry forests and shrubland and becomes wild in desert land. Also to mention is the Impatiens glandulifera, herbaceous plant, genus, balsam family, occurring mostly in tropical Africa and Asia. The seeds are slung away out of their fruit capsules when touched or by springing open due to the ripeness of the seed. Yellow balsam, Impatiens nolitanger, touch me not, which was introduced into Europe from Asia. Still to mention is the rampantly growing ambrosia, coming from North America, Ambrosia artemisifolia. Greek, immortality/Greek mythology. Food of the gods which gave them eternal youth and immortality, which today can already hardly be stopped anymore. Aside from that, there exist still numerous other plants which have been introduced into Europe as well as into other countries, such as the giant hogweed, Heracleum mentagasianum, in Europe, which is also called giant cow parsnip and giant cow parsley, which grows up to 5 meters high and which needs a special description because it is more than just an annoying weed. Rather, it must be labeled an invasive neophyte and an intrusive new plant, which spreads and allows no room for other plants. Its seeds fly out and, above all, germinate frequently on streams and rivers, as well as on wasteland and on waysides, but also find their way into gardens. It establishes itself on nutrient-rich sites which are not too dry. Every plant forms between 10,000 and 50,000 seeds which are even capable of floating. With human beings, it causes serious burns to the body when they come into contact with the sap of the giant hogweed. Those affected first feel a burning on the skin and then a swelling which can go as far as the forming and peeling off of blisters. Depending on the effect of the sunlight, the most serious form is reached after about 2 days. The sap of the plant contains so-called furocomarines, which, in connection with sunlight, lead to second-degree burns. Sunlight therefore plays the decisive role such that it comes to a phototoxic reaction. After contact with the aggressive sap of the giant hogweed, it therefore means that one must avoid the sunlight above all. Also, after it abates, the sun protection should still continue. The symptoms can be treated with outpatient treatment, for example, with painkillers, cortisone cream and by cooling. Also, the increase in constantly more extreme weather conditions leads to further catastrophes, as well as to the loss of fertile land and to immense pollution of the waters through chemicals, human and animal excrement, household waste, industrial waste, plastics of all kinds, antibiotics and artificial fertilizers, and so forth. Also the acidification of the seas, and so forth, the use of pesticides, herbicides, neonicotinoids and all kinds of other poisons, as well as the industrial and heating exhaust gases and the emissions from cars and other combustion engines endanger and destroy the biological diversity. Altogether around 50,000 species of all genera and kinds of amphibians, plants, animals, insects, reptiles, beetles, aquatic creatures and all other creatures of all kinds disappear every year. And if that continues to this degree, then it is absolutely possible that by the year 2100 half of all genera and species of all living organisms such as plants, animals and insects, and so forth, will have become extinct. Expert calculations speak of approximately 30% of the amphibians, 24% of the mammals, and 12% of the birds. Furthermore, among those are also marine life forms, whereby it is calculated that, In the case of overfishing not being stopped, no commercial fishing will be possible anymore at the latest by the year 2050, because the seas and all waters will be absolutely completely fished empty. If it actually goes that far, then this means that more than 1.5 billion human beings will be deprived of their only source of protein, upon which their life depends. This, along with the fact that also the entire majority of the terrestrial humanity will no longer have any possibility at all to be able to use fish and other marine and aquatic life forms as food. If the environmental pollution in the third world, that is to say, the developing countries, industrial countries, and emerging industrialized countries is considered, then one has to recognize that, based on the increasing depletion of natural resources and the rapid industrialization, it becomes incessantly ever greater, and indeed although in the OECD countries the environmental pollution has been reduced in the course of the years. In regard to that, there is also the fact to mention that when such decisions are made, the whole thing is not even a drop in the ocean, because during the time until such resolutions are applied in reality minus 10 or 20 years, and so forth, in each case the overpopulation grows around a further 100 million per year, which means that the resolutions, until they are implemented, are already very much out of date again, by a long way, and the problems are still many times greater than at the time when the resolutions were made. If, with all the natural and unnatural causes of death, according to the current worldwide growth of the population, one starts with an average of 100 million human beings per year, then the increase in the number of overpopulation for the next 35 years up to the year 2050 is around 3.5 billion more human beings who will populate and torment the earth. Thus if, in the year 2015, the terrestrial humanity is in truth to be calculated as a number of more than 8.5 billion, according to exact pleasure and clarifications and counter to the wrong calculations and assertions of the Earth's statisticians, who in the year 2015 start with only approximately 7.4 billion and believe that in the year 2050 only 9 billion human beings will populate the Earth, then in the year 2050 there will be around 11.5-12 billion human beings who populate the Earth in excess and cause still very much more terribleness with their machinations, which have gotten very badly out of control of the good human nature in the whole of nature, the fauna, flora, the climate, in the seas and waters, on the land, the earth itself, and to the already very bad moral quality of life of the humanity. And this is because nothing is done against the actual terrible things, and only a fighting of the symptoms is carried out, because basically the cause of all the terrible things would have to be gotten to grips with, namely, the rampant overpopulation that incessantly continues to grow and is not stopped through a global birth regulation. In regard to the entirety of the worldwide misery and catastrophes, it must also be said that, among other things, the World Trade Organization's advancement of the dismantling of the trade restrictions has led to many countries undermining laws concerning the protection of the environment and consumers. Among other things, not only nature and its fauna and flora suffer, rather also the climate and the entire planet, as well as the human beings, naturally, because their health is immensely harmed, whereby the air pollution plays a decisive role, as a result of which 4 million human beings die annually worldwide. Also to lament is that, likewise, worldwide and each year, approximately 16 million human beings die of illnesses, and indeed caused by the consumption of chemically and, above all, bacterially contaminated water as well as similarly contaminated foods. The situation concerning the drinking water will become very precarious and paradoxical because, on one hand, the water will be increasingly in short supply based on ongoing droughts, while, on the other hand, strong downpours in many places will lead to hundreds of thousands of human beings having to make a great effort to get their drinking water, because it will be poisoned due to fertilizers that have been washed in from commercial horticultural facilities and from the farms, and so forth, whereby also poisonous algal blooms will arise in tremendous proportions. Due to the manifold chemical pollution of the soils and the waters, the drinking water becomes poisoned, especially through chemical fertilizers such as phosphorus and nitrogen, as well as through pesticides, herbicides and neonicotinoids which are introduced in horticulture, in agriculture and in all kinds of plantations. The chemical substances naturally also reach the groundwater and thereby also into the drinking water cycle. All the chemical substances are especially effective with warm weather, such that in open bodies of water, which are also used as sources of drinking water, the explosion-like proliferation of cyanobacteria, that is to say, so-called algal blooms, occurs. Visually, this expresses itself as blue-green discoloration of the waters as well as the forming of streaks and a green carpet of algae on the surface of the water. The whole matter of the bacteria formation in this regard forms an acute threat for the human being, because the bacteria produces various toxins which of course poison the water, so that when it is drunk or is also used just for cleaning teeth or for cooking, it causes diarrhea, vomiting and nausea as well as dangerous damage to the liver and kidneys. Through the heating and boiling of the water, the concentration of poison increases even more considerably. Consequently, thereby, under certain circumstances, the situation forms even more threateningly than is the case when the water is used without heating, that is to say, without boiling. Also to lament is that the production of garbage increases immensely and uncontrollably worldwide, and indeed especially in the industrialized countries, whereby, on one hand, there is less and less room to find for open garbage depots, which poison and befoul the environment anyway and spread diseases, while, on the other hand, much too little is done to usefully process the accumulating garbage of all kinds in the right kind and form. To process garbage in the right kind and form means that all that which is processed into ash can be burned, detoxified and used again in some form beneficially, while everything which can be utilized again is recycled, processed and supplied for new productions. However, instead of this, on one hand, the entire environment is defiled with the garbage which is becoming ever more immense worldwide, because it is simply thrown in the fields, waters, seas and forests by irresponsible citizens, who thereby endanger nature and fauna and flora and even the entire ecosystem. On the other hand, also the authorities and governments as well as waste removal companies, who act criminally and irresponsibly in regard to the garbage disposal, and indeed, by shipping the accumulating mountains of garbage into poor countries, as well as into newly industrialized countries and developing countries which have a great amount of garbage themselves, which they do not get control of. The fact is that in these countries only a tiny portion of the amount of garbage is collected, while the enormous remainder is simply thrown on the streets, fields and meadows as well as in the local waters and in the seas, and pollute and poison these as well as the entire environment. Thereby in particular the plastic and other synthetic garbage is extremely problematic, because these only completely break down after 100 to 700 years, depending on their kind. Especially this kind of garbage accumulates in the local waters and in the seas, and already at the present time forms carpets for several square kilometers in certain ocean gyres. But that is still not all, because besides that, in the course of time, as a result of the waters and seas wave movements and the UV light of the sun, the plastic garbage and other synthetic garbage will be worn down to the finest powder and will thus, on one hand, get into the food of the fish and other aquatic life forms, and on the other hand, thereby however also into the food chain of human beings who eat the fish and other aquatic life forms. Also to say is that the environmental pollution of every kind does not only cause the death zones in the waters, on the land as well as in the seas to advance extremely quickly, rather also the poisoning and destruction of fertile ecological areas which are of extremely great significance for biodiversity. Such death zones, which have come about as a result of enormous environmental pollution as well as through overfertilization of agricultural areas with nitrates and phosphates and so forth, in the current time comprise more than 3,200 square kilometers worldwide, and indeed additionally these fertilizers are washed into the streams, rivers, seas and oceans and cause enormous damage in these by evoking gigantic algae carpets, whereby the world of aquatic animals and aquatic plants is impaired and even killed. Plants as well as aquatic animals, and so forth, which have died in the water need bacteria to decay, which requires so much oxygen for their own existence that there is no longer enough of it for further aquatic life forms and aquatic plants. Therefore, consequently, neither fish nor crabs and mussels or other aquatic animals and other creatures can continue to exist, not to mention the natural aquatic plants, that is, aside from certain destructively working algae. In addition, it is also to be said that these kinds of death zones come about especially in warm and hot seasons such as spring, summer, and autumn, because, as a rule, in these seasons the bodies of water are not stirred up by storms, which normally ensure that the bodies of water are saturated with much more oxygen than is the case in storm-free times. Along with the catastrophic environmental pollution and environmental destruction due to the terrestrial humanity itself, as a consequence of all the irresponsible machinations resulting from the very badly getting out of control of the good human nature relating to the overpopulation, the earth and all life is disadvantaged through the climate change, whereby, because of this alone, the future of the humanity looks very gloomy. And as said, the terrestrial humanity itself is to blame for that because, through the emission of carbon dioxide, evoked by work machines which have high levels of gas of all kinds, by forestry, trade, heating, industry, coal and other emission-creating power stations, as well as through agriculture, billions of private households, transport with cars, diesel trains, airplanes and ships, as well as through nonsensical and irresponsible kinds of motorsports and so forth, the CO2 emissions have increased immeasurably. These have evoked the climate change, and indeed along with diverse other factors which are damaging nature, its fauna and flora and the health of human beings. And thereby the fact is that these CO2 emissions continuously increase even further in relation to the growth of the Earth's population, and indeed much more than corresponds to the stupid and wrong prognostications which are calculated by would-be experts, who are always completely off the mark with their idiotic assertions, because they do not take the continuously growing overpopulation, which annually amounts to around 100 million, into consideration with their confused calculations. Thereby also no radical countermeasures adapted to the circumstances are taken, which can only be based in the curbing of the growth of the terrestrial population, indeed in the form of a worldwide effective and governmentally controlled regulation of births. And because this does not happen, the CO2 output will continue to drastically increase and probably double within the next 15 years, whereby inevitably more and more frequent, climatically conditioned natural catastrophes will appear and cause monstrous destruction, thus in nature itself, as well as to human achievements, and that thereby also innumerable human lives will be to lament, will be just as inevitable as that, as mentioned, the output of carbon dioxide will increasingly take the upper hand, just because the increasing energy consumption will climb immeasurably, because, in accord with the growth of the population, ever more human beings need correspondingly ever more energy. This will naturally not only be the case in the industrial countries, rather also in the newly industrialized countries, China and India, with their overflowing populations, which together alone have a population number of approaching 3 billion or around 3 billion. And now, if the economic need for energy in these countries is taken into consideration, there is a tremendous amount of that. And what thereby is emitted in poisonous and climate-destroying emissions by carbon and oil-driven power stations for the generation of electricity, and also from production in regard to the manufacture of aluminium, glass, steel and cement and so forth, cannot be justified anymore, just as the production of all necessary goods for the entire terrestrial humanity cannot. Also in this regard an emission of carbon dioxide occurs in tremendous amounts, and indeed not only in the newly industrialized countries, rather also in the industrialized countries themselves, because both in the richer as well as in the poorer countries the continuously uncontrolled growing overpopulation increases, and thereby also the consumption. And if all the newly industrialized countries and developing countries are viewed and considered, then with them there is a recognizable very great need to catch up in regard to the industrial countries, because in every form of development they do not want to lag behind the rich countries, and consequently therefore likewise justify growing consumer spending, just because they demand the same expensive standard of living as predominates in the rich industrial countries. Therefore it will be the case that in the coming time, the increasing number of personal cars will also cause the CO2 emissions to increase, as well as the environmental pollution and the destruction of nature and its fauna and flora, and indeed in relation to the increasing overpopulation. In the coming time the CO2 emission will therefore climb very drastically, and indeed in accord with the overpopulation which continues to spread. And since the oceans of the world are already thoroughly saturated with CO2, they will take up less of it. Presently it is still the case that for each ton of CO2 released by the humanity, somewhat more than half enters the atmosphere, while the remainder is taken up and absorbed by the seas of the world. The waters, therefore the world oceans, and also the inland bodies of water, are however already so saturated with the released CO2 that they can take up ever less carbon dioxide, which means that the atmosphere thereby becomes increasingly burdened and overburdened and damaging to the health of all life forms. The climate change does its bit as well, because as a result of the surface water of the seas and other bodies of water becoming continuously warmer, the water circulation slows. Consequently, the surface water sinks into the depths less and less. However, this has the consequence that the carbon dioxide no longer is transported into the depths, and the water which is richer in nutrients can no longer rise. Thereby, of course, the phytoplankton gets less food, which has very negative consequences for the world ocean's production of oxygen, as it naturally also does for the fish stocks and for other aquatic life forms, in whose food chain the plankton is of great and fundamental importance. Along with carbon dioxide, the terrestrial humanity also produces other gases such as methane and laughing gas, which fill and poison the atmosphere and naturally also contribute to the warming of the earth. Self-evidently, there are also the aerosols to mention, especially the smallest soot particles which deposit themselves in the lowest layers of the atmosphere, troposphere, and impair the climate. Also, a great part of the energy generated by human beings, as thermal discharge, has a very harmful effect on the atmosphere and the climate, because only a very small part radiates into outer space. Consequently, the greatest amount of thermal discharge remains in the immediate atmospheric environment and has a damaging effect all around, and also furthers the climate change rapidly, which naturally does not take its course slowly and steadily. Rather, based on feedback loops, it advances ever more quickly. Among other things, the entire thing thereby leads to higher temperatures arising, which, for example, in the Amazon, causes incessantly more evaporation of the water than would normally be the case. This factor naturally leads inevitably to the rainforest also suffering from that and withering because of it, which in turn has the consequence that also through that, therefore not only through the eradication of the forest, carbon dioxide is released, and indeed through the decay and decomposition of the withered trees and plants. A further result is the drying out of the soil, trees and plants, which has the consequence that wildfires come about as a result of natural factors or factors evoked by human beings, which in turn produce tremendous amounts of CO2. Moreover, the increase in CO2 also is accelerated in another way, and indeed because through the climatic warming, large areas of the permafrost rocks of the mountains and the permafrost soils thaw, whereby in the permafrost soils alone more than 1.6 trillion tons of carbon dioxide is stored. Since the beginning of the industrialization, the Earth human being has released only 110 billion tons. Along with the CO2 bound up in the permafrost soils are moreover tremendous amounts of methane gas, which has an even worse effect on the climate than CO2, when it is understood that this climate gas is around 30 times as effective as carbon dioxide. Furthermore, methane is also bound up in tremendous amounts in frozen sediments on the floor of the seas, from out of which it is released as a result of terrestrial movements and heat, and so forth, and gets into the atmosphere. When it comes so far that the methane gas defrosts as a consequence of the warming of the ocean water, then that leads to the average temperature of the world further drastically changing and climbing by up to 7 or 8 degrees Celsius. But that is not all, because very great amounts of methane are also produced by many millions of livestock, by cows, cattle, pigs and poultry, and so forth, which serve as animals for slaughter for meat production, and so forth, in order to feed the humanity and its domestic pets with meat, and whose number constantly increases based on the growing demand for meat. When, at the present time, about 360 million tons of meat products are consumed annually by the terrestrial humanity without the domestic pets, then, concerning this, by the year 2050 approximately 530 million tons is to be expected. The indisputable fact is that the output of carbon dioxide grows incessantly due to the very fast-growing overpopulation, and indeed as a result of the various overpopulation-conditioned causes, such as the increasing use of motor vehicles of all kinds, indeed due to cars, ships, airplanes and other means of transport, but also the increasing use of work machinery of all kinds, which emit gigantic amounts of CO2, as also innumerable motorized sports vehicles generate immense amounts of carbon dioxide, while for the meat production millions of animals, poultry and other creatures create gigantic amounts of methane. And this is not only continuously so in the current time, rather it also will be in the coming time. Effectively, it all came about already many decades ago, and indeed since the beginning of the incessantly climbing overpopulation and its connected very badly getting out of control of the good human nature and criminal machinations in association with the chemical science, the irresponsible exploitation and poisoning as well as destruction of many bodies of water, the wars, the exploitation of resources of all kinds, the development of technology, environmental poisoning, environmental destruction as well as the destruction of nature and its fauna and flora, and so on, and so forth. As an inevitable consequence of everything, which goes into the thousands and cannot all be listed, also the climate has been affected in a devastating form as a result of the criminal and even felonious machinations, which are very badly out of the control of the good human nature, which inevitably came forth and come forth from the overpopulation. Consequently, from now on, the climate change, which has its effect worldwide, brings natural catastrophes upon natural catastrophes. Thereby, in nature and its fauna and flora, immense changes are called forth, which change the entire ecosystem and cause unimaginable destruction and annihilation in it. Furthermore, also in the existence of the humanity itself there appear a growing amount of catastrophic effects, and indeed especially in the form of continuously increasing unemployment, of hatred of asylum seekers, foreigners, human beings, neighbors, and religions, and also in the form of energy shortages, floods of refugees, famines, new illnesses and rampantly spreading diseases, water shortages and shortage of space to live, as well as growing organized crime and felony. Among human beings unconcernedness becomes more and more extreme, as does need and misery, enmity and disfavor, while human life is given ever less respect, attentiveness, dignity and value. Consequently, increasing numbers of human beings kill themselves as a result of weariness and cowardice in regard to life, as also continuously more human beings are murdered or tormented due to anxiety, jealousy, hate, greed for might or money, quarreling as well as a consequence of psychopathic paranoid moods, and of having gotten very badly out of control of the good human nature. In this form family dramas and deadly family tragedies as well as suicides also increase just as do murderous moods of psychopathic paranoid jealous ones, haters, those with the pathological craving for revenge or control, sectarians and other male and female perpetrators, all who are going crazy. Much will therefore get so badly out of the control of the good human nature that continuously more mass murders will arise and bring very much suffering over human beings. But that is not all, because, in the future, there will be increasingly malicious quarrels, killings, wars, acts of terror and civil wars to record, which will be carried out by the military, the mightful ones of the state, terror organizations of various shades, such as the Hydra-like Islamist state with its always newly arising felonious offshoots in diverse countries, against which there will only be an inadequate and lax prevention by those in positions of responsibility in the military in countries. And if one of these groups is fought and eliminated, then instead, as with the Lernaean Hydra, two new murderous offshoots arise, which rage, murder, destroy and eliminate in the worst form. But also to mention are wars and acts of terror which are caused by dictators, imperious ones, politicians as well as religious fanatics and sectarian fanatics, and as a consequence of the shortage of medicines and nourishment, that is to say, food and water. But also the malicious racial hatred of every form will extremely and increasingly escalate, especially promoted even further through the increasingly spreading refugee movement out of diverse dictatorial countries which are hostile to human beings and are thus being fled. Sheer racial terror and racial wars are to be feared as a result of malicious racist hate groups and racist organizations, in a form which is very strong and increased compared to how it is these days in the year 2015. And in this regard it will be private groups as well as new organizations which have a similar direction to, for example, those in the form of the neo-Nazis, the Aryan Brotherhood and the Aryan Nation and so forth, which have existed since the 20th century in Europe, Russia and the USA as well as in diverse other countries, and work and rage just as maliciously and even murderously as does the Ku Klux Klan, which has been responsible for innumerable racial murders in the USA since the 19th century. In the future also destruction in regard to human achievements will occur in increasing measure, and indeed through the very badly getting out of control of the good human nature, maliciousness and wantonness of the human being himself/herself, as well as due to the increasing natural catastrophes. Also the hate, the jealousy and the unconcernedness as well as lack of relationships will altogether increasingly spread among the human beings, as also the value of human life will be disregarded constantly more, consequently body and life will be harmed and murdered wantonly and in a thoughtless form which is very badly out of the control of the good human nature and maliciousness. Also greed, vices and addictions of all kinds will increase just as much as murder and manslaughter, and indeed also in families, schools and groups whereby, in addition, religious, fanatical sectarianism and the psychopathic paranoid cases of very badly getting out of control of the good human nature will become just as fundamental forms as the disorders of a thoughts feeling psyche-based form and brainwashing factors and alienation from reality as well as consciencelessness, and so forth. Now, even if this is still disputed today by the irrational know-it-alls and experts, as well as by irresponsible scientists and so forth, who are paid for that by conscienceless companies, the indisputable fact is that the emissions of carbon dioxide, which have occurred until now and which continue to tremendously increase, are to blame for the worldwide increase in temperature which, depending on these circumstances, can amount to 6 or even 8 degrees by the year 2100. Thereby the fact is also that, with every degree of warming of the atmosphere, the tropical cyclones increase up to 35%. But that is not all, because also the Arctic and Antarctica are affected by the increase in temperature. Consequently, the thickness of their ice layers diminishes as a consequence of the melting, as is the case in regard to all mountain glaciers on the entire Earth. If the climatic warming continues on to the same extent as it is until now, indeed through the very badly getting out of control of the good human nature in every regard, which arises as the consequence of the overpopulation, then already in 25 years the Arctic can be ice-free in summer. And if with that it is considered that the Arctic's ice surface once amounted to 7 million square kilometers, however today only around 3 million square kilometers, then the entire thing presents a gloomy picture of the future, which also says that the warming of the Earth thereby increases all the more because the fact namely is that the smaller the surface of ice becomes the less the sun's rays are reflected. A further factor of climate change and of the melting of the ice also occurs namely through the sea level rising, and indeed presently around 4.5 millimeters per year. Therefore it is easy to calculate that by the year 2100 the rise in the sea level will already have to be measured in meters. According to calculations, the rise in the sea level shall amount to around 45% through the melting of inland ice, while around 55% of it shall be caused through the increase of temperature and the connected expansion of the ocean water. Also to say in regard to the oceans is that the coastlands on the North Sea will have to adapt to higher storm tides, because by the end of the 21st century they will be up to more than 1.5 meters higher than they are today. Already just the rise of the sea level of around 55-60 centimeters would destroy valuable habitats, such as wetlands, shallow water zones and salt marshes. With a rise of the ocean level of around a meter on the North and Baltic Sea, around 15,000 square kilometers of coast and hinterland will be flooded, whereby much of the land, which at the current time is inhabited and farmed by around 4 million human beings, will be below the waterline. However, along with that there is yet another threatening scenario due for Europe, namely that through the warming of the atmosphere a collapse of the Gulf Stream will occur and a new ice age can befall Europe, which however must not yet, in the current time, be accepted as a probability, however under certain circumstances must be taken into consideration. The climate change also calls forth continuously more and more tremendous geological changes to the planet Earth itself, such as rock falls, mudslides and mud flows as a consequence of the thawing of the permafrost, as well as through extreme rainstorms. On the surface of the Earth and on the floor of the ocean there arise fissures in the Earth mantle, and consequently also great shifts in the Earth mantle, along with which the continuously more gigantic primeval hurricanes and tsunamis break out over the Earth, and cause catastrophic destruction in nature and to human buildings of all kinds, and also will cost many thousands upon thousands of human lives. The established natural laws will unravel and drastically change into new forms, which will lead to new geological changes and natural changes, to which the humanity must inevitably adapt, or, if it does not do so, it comes to an end. The entire matter of adaptation also means that a worldwide stoppage to births must occur and, coming out of that, self-evidently, a global birth regulation, but also that all machinations of every kind which destroy nature, fauna, flora and the climate, as well as all other human machinations of every kind worldwide which have gotten very badly out of the control of the good human nature, are finally ended. But still another scenario is due, namely that by the year 2100 the global raised temperature leads to bad droughts, such that also the Amazon rainforest will be negatively affected and will be destroyed by up to 75%. If the entirety of all destructions continue to go on in such a form as has been called forth through the overpopulation machinations, which are badly out of the control of the good human nature. Thereby, however, it is already now clear that the terrestrial humanity and its governments and all the ones in positions of responsibility will not undertake any kinds of measures in order to stop the growth of the world population, as would indeed be necessary through a useful stoppage of births and a radical control of births in worldwide form. But this will also be the case in regard to the destruction of the areas of the Amazon, in which, in the best case, the destroyed rainforest areas will become grass and shrub savannas, or lifeless wasteland. But that is not all, because also southern Europe and southwestern USA, as well as the southwest of Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and also wide stretches of Australia can succumb to destructive dry periods in the future time, which then determine the regional climate very adversely. Inevitably, continuously more bush areas would arise and in this regard surpass everything known up until now. And the fact that these new dry periods will also lead to gigantic loss of crops everywhere is then no longer able to be changed. But furthermore, the dangers in regard to uncommonly gigantic floods will climb, for example, in the western South Americas, as well as in New Zealand, in northern Australia, and in the east of China, and so forth, while, in temperate regions, such as in the north of Europe, in Canada and in South America, greater useful agricultural areas will emerge, which will come about as a consequence of the climate change, which will then naturally lead to a higher yield of crops being able to be harvested, which also is associated with that because, with a higher CO2 content, diverse food plants and wild plants grow better and faster. However, it will also happen that, on the other hand, foreign animals, Birds and all kinds of foreign land and aquatic animals from foreign countries will acclimatize and settle, and indeed not only through the introduction as a consequence of the criminal globalization, rather also through a climate-conditioned direct migration. At the present, as well as in the future, the climate change will cause the greatest damage and destruction in poor countries, whereby, however, also the industrial countries will not remain spared from that. Seen altogether and worldwide, because of the climate change, its effects and the natural catastrophes, the damage, calculated in Swiss francs, will climb into the quadrillions. If one only thinks of the increase to the sea level worldwide, if it climbs only around a half a meter, then, on the coast, about 140 cities with more than 1 million human beings are threatened. Then it can be approximately calculated that tremendous human achievements and assets will be destroyed due to the rising water, which must likewise be calculated as a damage value of quadrillions of Swiss francs. But that scenario, which is to be expected, can go so far that even entire countries could disappear from the surface of the earth, such as the around 1,200 islands of the Maldives, because their highest elevation lies only just 2.4 meters above sea level. If the sea level climbs by even just half a meter, that will mean, and this will also come about with great probability, that a large portion of the islands will become uninhabitable. Further to say is that, through the warming of the earth, the sea waters advance ever further inland, and indeed both into the ground, which is farmed for the food production, as well as in the essential groundwater which serves the human beings as drinking water and irrigation water for the fields. The greatest victims of the climate change effects are effectively, as mentioned, the poor countries and their human beings, although they themselves have contributed to the entire warming of the earth by only a small part, which will also continue to be the case. And what there is to say in regard to the resources, which are exploited in these countries by companies of the industrial countries, the human beings of these poor countries thus barely participate in that or do not at all, if they have resources at all in their countries. But that is not all, because, through the consequences of the climate change alone, problems arise in the poor countries which can no longer be overcome. If regarding this, the coming droughts are spoken about, which will inevitably come, then the mature fields dry out and even become completely infertile. Consequently, also, as mentioned, famines will increase. Besides that, sources of water dry up due to the dryness, whereby the human beings as well as nature and its fauna and flora are confronted with such a water shortage that death to human beings as well as to the fauna and flora increasingly escalates. Through the dryness also the waters suffer, and because of their lowering, naturally so will ship travel as well as the hydroelectric power stations, because far more than half of the water taken from nature will be used in the energy production industry, as it especially will be in regard to nuclear power stations, which need river water to cool their facilities. So, in the future, if these power stations are not shut down early for rational reasons, they will have to be shut down when the water shortage no longer allows water to still be squandered for such power plants. At the same time, in contrast to that, is the increasing energy expenditure for air conditioners and the daily energy use for households, agriculture and industry, and indeed in relation to the unlimited and increasingly rapidly climbing overpopulation. Further to lament would be that the heat and dryness coming in the future in regional parts of Europe will lead to loss of crops, while in other regions, however, the agriculture can count on good and even increasing yields, because new types of grains will be cultivated, which only need very little moisture and additionally will be more heat resistant than the sorts of today. In parts of Europe the heat will climb more frequently over the 40 degrees Celsius mark and bring tremendous problems for the human beings. In regard to the forests, due to the increasing climatic warming there will be a mass death of spruce trees, because this kind of tree requires more of a cooler climate. Consequently, tree species such as maple, beech, oak and southern kinds of trees which are more heat and drought resistant will increasingly replace the northern conifers. Therefore, in the entirety of Europe, a large portion of the native trees will disappear because of climate change, whereby, however, as said, more and more species from southern Europe and other regions of the earth will get established in Europe, just as will also be the case with animals, insects, birds, aquatic life forms, and all kinds of creatures. From then on, especially those genera and species which until then were only guests of spring, summer, and autumn, will ultimately settle in Middle and Northern Europe and remain all year round. Therefore it is thereby also clearly said that the winters in all of Europe will turn out very much milder and more humid in the future than they are today. Thereby, naturally, in all locations also the need for heating will decrease, as also the times with frost and coldness will sharply fall. Nevertheless, in winter there will arise severe storms and torrential rainfalls, whereby much high water, mud flows and floods will cause terribleness and great destruction, as well as bring much suffering, need, and misery over the human beings. Frost and snow will become steadily less, and therefore, because of the climate change, will considerably retreat, and indeed, by estimation, to below 900 meters in lower sites. That will naturally also tax the operators of winter sports facilities and cause them to go bankrupt, because the mountain areas will become snow-free. Irrationally, sports skiing slopes will at first be carried on with artificial snow, which naturally again needs enormous energies as well as enormous amounts of water, until these can also no longer be procured and their wastage must ultimately be given up or forbidden. In regards to Middle and Northern Europe, the effects of the climate change will be relatively small in regard to drought catastrophes, which call forth tremendous changes in those countries which are befallen by them, and where tremendous water shortages will also prevail. Nevertheless, also the entirety of Europe will have to suffer droughts as well as water shortages, whereby, however, also primeval storms and extreme weather events as well as serious floods increase, and in this regard cause great catastrophes, damage and destruction, and cost many human lives. Naturally, in the long term, also the average annual temperature will increase there, whereby, by the year 2100 it must be expected to be up to 4 or even 7 degrees, and indeed, depending on how the further destruction of nature, its fauna and flora, and the climate change develop due to the further tremendous growth and measures, which have gotten very badly out of the control of the good human nature, of the overpopulation. However, it will certainly be the case that in the entirety of Europe the summers will become hotter and drier. Consequently, the summer temperatures will climb to 30 degrees or more even in the shade. That means that the human beings living in Middle and Northern Europe who are not accustomed to such high temperatures will succumb to difficulties with life because, due to ozone and smog, dangerous damage to the bronchial tubes and lungs arise, and also increasing death rates due to collapse from heat or heart attacks will be to lament. In this coming time, in Europe, as a consequence of the increasing climatic warming, a mortality rate of up to 6% for each further degree of warmth will have to be expected. Indeed, as a consequence of the Middle and Northern Europeans not being accustomed to the high temperature. This Europe-wide climb and temperature, which goes hand in hand with the shift of the climatic zones, also, however, brings with it new illnesses and rampantly spreading diseases, such as especially ones out of southern countries, whereby malaria, along with other tropical illnesses and also serious rampantly spreading diseases, will be right at the very front. But not only the summers of the future, rather also the spring and autumn will take their toll in regard to the damage to health of the Europeans. For example, the tick bites in the early summertime, whereby borreliosis and meningoencephalitis will be brought about. Also, skin cancer will have a rich harvest as a consequence of the solar radiation, which will become ever more aggressive, and indeed not only in summer, but also in spring and autumn. But due to the climatic changes, also the chemical poisons which are spread on natural foods will bring about heretofore unknown changes, whereby the human beings will increasingly become sick with allergies and gastrointestinal disorders. If the glaciers are considered as a further consequence, then to say is that the melting of the Himalayan glaciers alone, which threatens in the future, will become a catastrophe for more than 1.5 billion human beings, because the water shortage will claim its victims with terrible consequences. In India alone, when the great droughts come, the continued existence of the Magur agriculture will become a giant problem, from which around 65-75% of the population will be immediately affected. But also in the north of China, as well as in other countries, areas of land will wither and become desolate, or other desert-like areas will continue to spread out. Thus, in the future, droughts, however also destructive floods and all kinds of extreme weather events and earthquakes, will drive many African, Central African and Southeast Asian countries into a national decay. And so, as already today the worldwide movement of refugees has grown immensely, as was already predicted in the 1950s, and also at a later time, the mass migrations of peoples and flight of peoples will begin in earnest. If today the numbers of fleeing refugees per year can be coped with by the countries which receive them, in 35 to 50 years there will be around 300 to 350 million refugees who leave their homelands as a consequence of the climate change and its catastrophic consequences, as well as the effects of negative and difficult political, militaristic, religious and terroristic unrest and machinations, and they will seek new refuge worldwide in foreign countries, whereby quite especially, as it already is these days, Europe will be preferred. And this is the case in regard to all masses of refugees which come from all over the world, however especially out of Africa and Arabia, and with big floating coffins and poor wooden and rubber boats, land on the Italian and Greek islands or on the mainland, if they do not first capsize, fall into the ocean, or are not thrown in by the people smugglers and drown. Therefore, as time passes it becomes increasingly the case, and indeed already from the current time, that the streams of asylum seekers become ever more immense and extensive, as well as ever more uncontrollable, and indeed not only out of the African continent, rather also out of the Balkans and Eastern countries, out of diverse countries of South America, as well as out of Asia and the Near East and Far East. So it also comes about, and indeed already from the current time, that thereby occurring problems in regard to the streams of refugees can no longer be coped with by the authorities, politicians, aid organizations, custody officials and security forces of the countries that the refugees penetrate or migrate. As a consequence, refugee camps arise out of abandoned houses, army buildings, barracks, containers, tent cities and wild camps, and so forth, where untenable and miserable hygienic conditions prevail, and also aggressions and quarrels will come about with bad consequences among the crammed together refugees who are from different countries, religions, sects and have different societal standing. Also incessant criminality, illnesses, rampantly spreading diseases, murder and manslaughter escalate, whereby also an inadequate food and drinking water supply will further contribute greatly to all arising terrible things. Therefore, also in the refugee camps, already in a short time, a shortage of food and water will prevail and trigger jealousy, hate, quarrel and fist fights among the refugees themselves, which will also claim casualties and, under certain circumstances, cause deaths. As time goes on, the more it will be that a true refugee chaos arises in many forms, and also, for all federal security agencies such as supervising officials, custody officials, police officers and customs officials, circumstances which cannot be coped with will arise to do with control, regulation and monitoring and other problems at the country's borders and in the countries themselves. Along with that, as time goes on, in the countries of refuge, due to the floods of refugees, mostly economic refugees, which especially penetrate into Europe, as well as into other countries, there arise more and more of the most serious problems for the populations of the countries, their authorities, governments, politicians and political parties in regard to contradictory, false humanitarian, supporting as well as opposing views and opinions in regard to the admission or non-admission, that is to say, the intake or rejection, as well as the treatment, the rights and the deportation again of the ever-increasing refugees. That which continues to loom already in the current time as a result of the movement of refugees, and will expand incessantly in the future, is a mixing of the world population, which can no longer be held up anymore, because the causes, already set today, Indeed, the floods of refugees will not be stopped due to false humanitarian reasons. Therefore, an incessant and worldwide racial mixing and mixing of peoples will be just as unavoidable as will the new mixed race humanity which arises from that, as well as a mixing of the religions and their sects, out of which also manifold enmities and hatred will come forth. Through the climate change, the entire thing becomes a consequence in a form through which, however, the whole world is affected, and indeed because, due to the change of the climate, the number of weak and fragile countries will continuously increase from which floods of refugees will come. Therefore, it will self-evidently have further consequences, being that, in all countries which receive refugees there will be serious distribution conflicts, and indeed to an excessive degree, such that it will overshadow everything that already is the case in the current time in Europe, since the EU dictatorship dictates to its member countries how many refugees they have to accept. Conclusion: intellect and rationality must be clearly and unambiguously called for and expressed. Just as in the future all nations of the world must very drastically limit emissions worldwide as well as the exploitation of resources. Along with that, the application of chemicals in nature and its fauna and flora, and thereby the entire chemical and garbage-determined environmental pollution, environmental poisoning and environmental destruction must be immediately forbidden and stopped, as must the rapidly increasing overpopulation be stopped by very quickly introducing and carrying out a worldwide and federally controlled and effective regulation of births. Only in this way can the widespread human tragedy still abate, which threateningly becomes apparent on the earth human beings' horizon of destiny, and worldwide already brings drastic and maliciously negative as well as catastrophic and destructive consequences. Not only does all the filth in the air change the climate, rather, notably all of the consequences of the human being badly getting out of the control of the good human nature, and destruction in regard to nature, its fauna and flora as well as the climate. The entirety of all current natural catastrophes is an urgent warning of the consequences of climate change. If that is not very quickly steered away from, the earth will ultimately no longer be in the position of meeting even the most necessary requirements of the humanity. Consequently, the constantly increasing demand for energy, food and water can no longer be met. If nothing is done for the best, then the entirety of all machinations which have very badly gotten out of the control of the good human nature, called forth by the overpopulation, will lead to an inescapable, widespread human tragedy. Therefore all nations of the world are called upon to grasp the now only small chance to avoid this tragedy. But that stipulates, first and foremost, that a controlled worldwide stoppage to births is effected and a worldwide birth control is introduced so that the overpopulation quickly becomes constrained, and nature and its fauna and flora as well as the climate can recover again from all the destruction which has arisen due to the machinations, which have very badly gotten out of the control of the good human nature, of the overpopulation. The time has long ago passed, when lax, idiotic, useless and unserviceable international climate protection agreements can be passed, because now intellect and rationality and a resolute, drastic, clear, useful and valuable action are demanded, in order to finally still indeed prevent the threatening earth-human tragedy of the future. Appendix: the area of Switzerland. When the entire areas of all mountains and hills of Switzerland are added together into the ground area measurement, then the entire area of Switzerland amounts to over 80,000 square kilometers. The area of Switzerland, as was taught in school, is 41,285 square kilometers. However, that is wrong, when only the simple ground area without the entire areas of all the mountains and hills is calculated. Switzerland is at least twice as big, namely over 80,000 square kilometers, when the entire ground areas, and therefore also the areas, that is to say, steep faces, rocks, cliffs, and so forth, of the mountains and hills are calculated. That is also demonstrated by the latest measurements and calculations with very exact elevation models and quick computers, such as SwissTopo, which has newly calculated the true surface area of Switzerland for MTW, mentioned Technikwissenschaft, in detail. The 41,285 square kilometers would therefore only be correct if all mountains and hills in Switzerland were completely flat. Simmons to Silver Star Center, 21. July 2015, 10.39 Billy.